Quite often when I'm teaching a beginner or maybe even an intermediate student how to do a bend for the first time, I find that most students have instincts on how to do a bend that are pretty far off from what should actually be happening when a bend comes up in something that they're playing. So I find that the typical beginner student, the first time that they attempt to do a bend, they're trying to do something that looks kind of like this, where they're just pushing the string up a little bit with just one finger, and they have a hand position that doesn't really lend very much support or strength in the pushing of that string. And also, they often don't have a very clear idea of how far they're trying to bend the note as well. And all those things come together to form a bend that doesn't sound very good. It's out of tune. It's slow. It just sounds out of place. Um, so in this video, I wanted to go over the basics of how your hand should be positioned in order to do a bend effectively. I'm going to go through some of the fine points of how to prepare a bend, as well as how to move as you're doing a bend to get a smooth and easy feel for it. I'll also go into some of the different types of bends that you're likely to encounter in lead guitar playing. And finally, I will go over some ways that you can practice bends to just get better at them in general. So I'll hit that at the end of the video. So first up, let's look at the basics of the hand position that you should be in when you go to do a bend. If you're doing what I call bending position, that would mean most of the time, I mean, not all the time, but probably at least 75% of the time, you're going to want to use your third finger here to fret the note that is actually going to be bent. If I'm here on the 14th fret of the third string, that's going to be where my ring finger goes. Then you're going to want to have one or two other fingers on the same string just behind it so that they can help with pushing the string up. So you don't want to have to push the string up with just one finger. It's tough to get enough strength in just one finger to do that. You want to have multiple fingers pushing so that none of them have to work too hard. So if possible, you would want to have fingers 1 and 2 on the same string behind it. You want your fingers to be spread out to where each finger is in its own fret. So my index finger is back in the 12th fret, my middle finger is in the 13th fret, and my ring finger is in the 14th fret. And that's the note that is actually going to be played. Once you're in that position, you want to bring your thumb up over the top of the neck and hook it over just a little bit. It doesn't have to be coming way over like that. You're not necessarily trying to fret a note up there or anything, but let it just kind of peek over the top. Um, and then you also want your fingers here to be coming at the strings at a bit of an angle. So you can see how I'm not trying to meet the strings with my fingers straight up and down to where they're parallel to the frets like this. Instead, you want your hand to be pivoted to the side a little bit, so they're meeting the strings at an angle. The lower part of your index finger here, back where your big knuckle is in your hand, that part of your finger should be making contact with the bottom of the neck of the guitar. And so that is bending position right there. Assuming you're in that position, you're in a good place to be able to easily push the string up with all three fingers. So your fingers will extend out like this. It's kind of like they're extending out kind of like that. But along with that motion of the fingers extending out, there's also going to be a little bit of a turning of the forearm. I call it the doorknob movement. It's kind of like you're twisting your hand to turn a doorknob, only just at a smaller scale. So there's a little bit of that movement along with the pushing of the fingers out. So it just looks kind of like this. So that way you're enlisting the use of some stronger muscles back in your wrist and forearm to help out also. So it looks just kind of like that. Now, one thing that's tough to grapple with is the other strings that are in the way that you have to kind of push out of the way as you do the bend. So what you want to have happen there is you want those strings to end up pushed up against the tips of your fingers here so that they're lifted a little bit away from the fretboard, but not coming up over top of your fingers either. So they're just immobilized, pushed up against the tips of your fingers here. That way they're not going to make any noise or feel uncomfortable as you push the string up. So you would want to avoid having something like this happen, where the strings kind of come up over top of the fingers here. You'd also want to avoid letting the string slip underneath the fingers, because you might accidentally get some weird sounding notes that way that are sounding out of tune. So instead, you want it to be kind of between those two extremes, where they're just pressed up against the fingertips, lifted a little bit away from the fretboard, but not rolling over the top of the fingers. Now, to get that to happen, if you have a tough time getting that to actually happen when you do a bend, you should examine how much your fingers are curled around before you do the bend. So I find that if you have trouble with the strings riding up over top of the finger like this, that is the result of the fingers being too curled around at the beginning of the bend. So this here, what I have is too much curling in the fingers. It's kind of like I'm trying to do a C chord or something. So that's too much. And what's going to happen there is as your fingers extend out, as you do the bend, that string there is probably going to hit your fingernail and then just be lifted up over your fingernail by doing that. So if that's happening, then start the bend with your fingers a little less curled, more like this, to where they're extended out a little bit. On the other hand, if you have trouble with these strings slipping underneath your fingertips, I'm getting weird sounds like that. That is usually the result of your fingers not being curled around enough at the beginning of the bend. So if I started the bend with my fingers really extended out like this, then as I push up, my fingers are not going to extend out. Instead, they're just going to kind of push up in a straight position like this. And that's going to cause these other strings to just kind of slip underneath the fingers. And then they'll be underneath your fingers to where you're actually possibly fretting notes on those strings. So if that's happening a lot, then you need to just curl a little bit more. So if you have the right amount of curl in your fingers at the beginning of the bend, you'll be able to hit the string that you come into contact with here, and then it won't ride up over your fingernail, but it'll just end up on the skin on the tips of your fingers. And then as your fingers extend out, you'll just slightly lift the strings away from the fretboard, keeping them comfortable and silent. So another aspect of doing bends is silencing the strings in your right hand. That's actually an important element that's easily overlooked. So if you don't do that, you're going to get some extra noise when you release the strings from the bend. So if I just simply do a bend here and then just bring the strings back down, you can see how I get that sound of the strings ringing there. And it doesn't matter what I do with my left hand. I could be absolutely perfect in everything that I execute with my left hand, and that sound will still happen when I release the strings. So to prevent that, you have to use your right hand to mute those strings. So basically your right hand needs to mute any strings that are above the string that you're actually bending. So here I'm bending the third string. So my right hand, and more specifically, it's actually the side of my thumb here that's doing it. But the place on your hand that's going to be most comfortable for you might be different. It depends on how you hold the pick and the position that your hand is in normally. For me, the way I hold the pick is kind of like this, which leaves my thumb extended out and just really convenient for laying down on the strings. So basically, as I do this bend here, my thumb is laying across the sixth, fifth, and fourth strings so that when I release the bend, I don't get that sound. So that's also a very important element in keeping just extraneous ringing and noise from open strings from muddying things up when you do your bends. So now let's look at some of the different types of bends that you're likely to encounter in playing lead guitar. So there are a few different dimensions that you see some variety here. So one is how far you push the string up, or how far you push the note away from its original sounding note where you are. So the most common would probably be a full bend, in which case you're bending the note up until it sounds like the note that is 2 frets up from it, or a whole step, or a full tone up from it. That's why it's called a full bend. So if I were to do a full bend here on this note on the 14th fret of the 3rd string, that would mean that I'm going to push it up until it sounds like the note that's on the 16th fret of that string. So here's the 16th fret. That's what it sounds like. So if I do a full bend back here on 14, I would push it up until it matches that same note, just like that. The next most common is probably a half bend, in which case you're pushing the note until it sounds like the note that's just 1 fret up from it, or a half step up from it. So if I were to do a half bend on this same note on 14 here, I would just push it up until it sounded like the note that is in 15. So here's what 15 sounds like. If I do a half bend back here on 14, it would sound like this. Another common type of bend is a quarter bend. That is actually a unique one, and I'm actually going to circle back to that one before I finish up this section of the video. But a quarter bend essentially means that you're bending the note not even a half step. So you're basically bending the note a little bit out of tune. So the fact that you don't have another definitive note that you're bending to makes that type of bend a little bit different from the others. So again, I'm going to circle back around to that one in just a minute or two. So then you might also see bends that go even further away than a full bend. So if you were to do a 1.5 bend, so in a tab, you would see a 1.5 next to the arrow indicating the bend. That would mean you're supposed to bend 1.5 steps. So that if I was starting on 14 here, that would mean I'm going to bend it until it sounds like the note that is up on 17. This note right here. Just like that. Or if you saw a 2 next to it, that would be a 2 whole step bend. So in that case, I would be bending the note 2 whole steps up. So if I was on 14 here, I would bend the note all the way until it sounds like 18 there. Pretty far, but depending on where on the neck you're doing it, it's totally doable. Just like that. Sounds pretty cool. Another aspect of bends that you'll see some variation on is whether it's a bend and a release, or a pre-bend. So let me explain that. So a bend means that you only hear the note go up. So if I were to do a bend here, I'm going to do a full bend. So I'm making it sound like 16 here. If I was going to do a full bend without a release, so just the bend, that would mean it just goes up and you don't hear it come back down. So something like. So you can see in all those cases, you only heard the note go up. You didn't hear it actually come back down. Instead, I silenced the note before bringing it back down. And that's what you would have to do if you're only doing a bend but without a release and you don't want to hear it come down. Then that means you would do the bend, and then probably using your right hand, you would touch the string to silence it, and then you would bring it back down silently. On the other hand, you might be doing a bend and a release. So in that case, you would hear the note come back down. So if I did a bend and a release in this same spot, you would hear it go up and back down, just like that. So that's a bend and a release. And then you could also have a bend that is only a release. So that would also be called a pre-bend. And a pre-bend means you push the string up before you play it. And then once you've bent it up, you play it and then bring it down. So you only hear it fall down in that case. So in that case, you just have to kind of guess that you've gone far enough on the initial bend. So it just kind of comes with experience. It's also somewhat forgiving. If you're a little bit off there, you do have some wiggle room, because if you just simply start the descent of the bend right after you pick, you can be a little bit off in how far you've pushed the bend up to begin with and have it still sound pretty good. So now let's circle back to a quarter bend. So this is a unique one because, again, a half bend would mean you're just bending the note up to where it sounds like the note that's in the very next fret, a half step up. So a quarter bend means you're not even going that far. You're essentially bending the note out of tune just a little bit. And so since you're bending to a note that's out of tune, you're going to want to handle it in a very specific way, and you want to make sure you finesse it just right. If you don't, it's just going to sound like an out of tune note. It won't sound that good. But if you finesse it right, it'll give it just a little bit of movement, a little bit of twang to it that really sounds great. So if I was to do a quarter bend here on 14, so first of all, the bend itself is very small. I might push the string about that far. And you can see when I do it like that, it does just sound out of tune. It doesn't sound great. When you do a quarter bend, you actually want to spend most of the time that you're on that note not bent. So let's say hypothetically that this note was going to last for one beat. You would want to spend most of that one beat not bent. And then just towards the end of that beat, you would want to push it up a little bit into that quarter bend. So I'd kind of wait and then bring it up a little bit. And then once it's reached its max height there, you would want to silence the bend. So you would not want to do a release on this type of bend. Doing a release just makes it sound out of tune again. So instead you want to just let it go up a little bit, silence it, and then go immediately to another note of some sort. So I might, maybe come back here to the 11th fret like that. That's essentially how you want to handle a quarter bend. Most beginners, when they've encountered this type of bend at first, they have a tendency to do the bend too soon. So again, assuming that the note was going to last for one beat, they might just immediately push that note up and hold it up in that bend for that entire beat. So you don't want to do that because that way the listener has enough time to register the fact that the note is actually out of tune. So instead, you want to wait, push it up just a little bit, towards the end of the duration of the note. And then another mistake that beginners often make with this type of bend is they let it release. They let it come back down. So they might end up sounding more like this, which doesn't really sound great. On the other hand, if you finesse it right, it would sound more like this. So it's a big difference. And now let's talk about how to interpret bends in tab. I wanted to go into how to read bends in tab better and just know exactly what it is you're supposed to do when you see a bend in a tab. There are basically two pieces of information that you get when you're reading a bend in tab. One is the arrows that point up or down or maybe even just down. And the other bit of information is there's going to be a little number just up next to the top of the arrow. So the arrows themselves tell you what type of bend you're supposed to do. So let's say if you're supposed to do a bend, like just a bend without a release, like this, that would be indicated by an arrow swooping up from the number in the tab. But you would only see the arrow going up. You would not see a down arrow. On the other hand, if you saw an up arrow and then another arrow after it that was curving back downwards, that would mean you're supposed to do a bend and a release. So it would mean you're supposed to take the bend up and back down. And then for a pre-bend, what you usually see is an arrow that is pointing straight up from the note you're playing. So, I'm on the 14th fret here. You might see a 14 and then a line going straight up from it. And then from that line, an arrow swooping down. So if you saw a marking like that, that means it's supposed to be a pre-bend, which means you're supposed to just guess, push the note up silently, and hope that you've pushed it up the right amount, and then pick it and bring it back down. So then the other bit of information is the number that's next to the arrow. So that is telling you how far you should bend. So if you see the word full next to the bend, that would mean it's supposed to be a full bend, which I've already explained. That means you're supposed to push the bend note up until it sounds like a note that is a whole step up from it, or 2 frets up. So if I was doing the bend on 14 here and I saw an arrow going up with the word full next to it, then that would mean I'm supposed to push this bend up until it sounds like the note on 16, just like that. On the other hand, if you saw a 1/2 next to it, that would mean it's supposed to be a half bend, in which case you're supposed to just push the bend up until it sounds like a note that's just a half step away, or 1 fret up from the note you're actually bending. For a quarter bend, you'll see a 1/4 next to it. That would mean you're supposed to do a quarter bend, like I was just going over a minute ago. For bends that are further than a full bend, like a 1.5 bend or a 2 whole step bend. For a 1.5 bend, you'll see a 1.5 next to it. So that would mean you're supposed to push the note up until it sounds like the note that's 3 frets up from it, or 1.5 steps. If you see a 2 next to it, that would mean you should push the bent note up until it sounds like the note that's 4 frets up from it, or 2 whole steps. So here's how you can work on your bends just to get them more refined and smooth and fast. So the first thing you're going to want to work on is hitting the right note that you're trying to bend to. So for that, what I would recommend is choose a note that you want to bend. And at first, it would be good to probably start someplace up near the 12th fret. That's the easiest place in the neck to do a bend. Choose a bend that you want to do. So I'm going to be on the 12th fret of the 3rd string here. And then choose the note that you want to bend to. So I'm going to bend up to 14. This would be a full bend. Then get in bending position. Well, first of all, play the note you're targeting. So here I'm playing 14. Just remember the sound of it. Then get on the note you're actually going to bend. Get in bending position, and then do the bend. And once you've done that, go back and check and see if it sounded the same as the note you're intending to hit. So you can do different variations of that. You can do a full bend. You could do a half bend. So here I'm going to play 13. This is the note I'm trying to bend to. Then I'll come back to 12, the note that I'm actually bending. I get in bending position, bend it up until I think I'm there, and then just check and see if I got it right or not. After you've done this for a while, you could then turn it around and start off by doing the bend without playing the note that you're bending to first. So I'm going to move to a different fret here. I'm going to maybe drop back to the 10th fret. So I would get in bending position and then choose a note that I want to bend to. So I'm going to try and bend up to 12 here. But in this case, don't play that note first. Just simply do the bend. And once you think you've gone far enough, see if you got it right or not. Try that in different places. So maybe I'll try it here on the 12th fret of the 2nd string. I'm going to try and bend up to 14, doing a full bend. And then check afterwards. So just get it to where you're pretty consistent on those, and try different types of bends. You could do half bends, full bends. Those are probably the most important ones at first, but eventually you could move on to bends that are even further away than that. You could also try different strings, different frets. It's going to feel a little different in each place on the neck. So you want to just get used to the fact that it feels different in every new place, and still have your ears be the main thing that's judging whether you've gone far enough or not. Once you feel like you've got a basic foothold on being able to hit the right note that you're trying to go for when you're doing a bend, the next order of business is practicing going into doing a bend from playing some other notes. One thing that's often really tricky for bends when people are new to them is there's quite a bit of setup involved in doing it. You've got to, get onto the note that you're going to bend with your ring finger. You have to get into bending position. You have to make sure that your fingers are curved right so you can keep the other strings out of the way. And it takes, some thought and some time to get all of that set before you do a bend. So you're going to want to work on being able to get into that setup as quickly as possible. So the best way to do that is to practice playing a few notes beforehand. It could be any notes, and then getting into bending position on the note you're trying to bend, and then doing the bend. So for instance, if I do this same note on the 12th fret here of the third string, I might do something like this. See how I just played a couple of notes before it, just to practice getting into bending position quickly and then doing the bend. So you can just try different variations of that. You could start above the note that you're going to bend, play down to it. Something like that. Or and of course you want to make sure that you're hitting the right note on the bend itself too. But that will get you used to snapping into that bending position as quickly as possible. So hopefully this will make your bends sound more precise and make them easier to do. Hopefully it'll give you a clearer idea of what should be happening when you go in to do a bend. Having good bends where you're able to consistently hit the right pitch without being out of tune in some way or another will go a really, really long way in making your lead playing sound much better overall, even if you're playing otherwise simple things when you play lead. If you found this video helpful, I would love it if you subscribe to the channel and help the channel grow. I'll be posting more videos in the days and weeks to come that are mainly centered around playing lead guitar, whether it's theory or technique or licks or different stylistic elements. So subscribe and stay tuned for that. All right, take care.